Black Lagoon is one of the most consistently fantastic pieces of fiction for a multitude of reasons. The plot is a sneakily addictive blend of overarching beats and smaller arcs, a large cast of well-utilized characters keeps each section fresh, and it perfectly understands how to contrast and compare those characters for maximum emotional and thematic effect, and nearly all of them are blended with real-world history to create some of the most stunningly realistic developments in anime history, despite the sometimes outrageous action or scenes. From Balalaika to Takanaka to the twins, we've dove deep into the history lessons the anime has many times, and today we're doing it once more with a so far neglected character here on the channel, Fabiola Iglesias, the second maid to the Lovelace family. She acts as a judge for Roanapur and its inhabitants, bringing a perspective of duty and responsibility where they dwell on doom and gloom, fight dancing her way across their city with a style dating back centuries, and a history all too present in modern day crisis. From self-defense turned dance to the decline of a petrostate, we've got a lot to cover in Fabiola. But first, longtime viewers will likely notice the ads on this video, which I began to omit from historical topics that cover tragedy. I'll have a few words on that at the end of the video, but for now, let's get into it.
Is that where you learn how to shoot and do those fancy leg moves?
Fancy leg moves? What does he mean?
Young master, he means capoeira.
At first glance, Fabiola's fighting style may seem like the anime's classic exaggerated action, and while it's certainly turned up to 11 for the show, this is based on a real style of both martial art and dance, capoeira. Now, due to its age and possible origins, there are only theories as to where this style comes from, not hard-set records. But there's a good reason for that lack of record, as it appears to have begun as a force against oppression. Starting in the 16th century and ending at the start of the 19th, Brazil was a colony of the Portuguese, and where there's an old colony, there's always slavery. Millions were shipped there over the years, and with the 17th century sugar boom, it was more profitable to work slaves to death and then buy new ones to make as much money as quickly as possible. If you didn't escape rather fast, that's where you die. And so a resistance formed where it could. In a country as vast as Brazil, that's 8.5 million square kilometers, the US is 9.8 for reference, villages of runaway slaves could form and grow unnoticed for some time at least. These communities were known as quilombos, where culture and traditions from Africa were preserved with some intermixing with the Brazilian natives. Knowing how fragile their freedom was, these communities also understood the need to develop self-defense tactics, and this is what's speculated as the origins of capoeira, a mixture of defense and cultural practice. At the same time as they trained their bodies through martial arts, they could express themselves and their culture through dance. It was effective, so much so that those chasing down runaway slaves came to fear the art, claiming it was harder to defeat the odd movements than it was a Dutch soldier. But it became a very meaningful cultural and social practice, shown best through the capoeira circle. Here, two practitioners are surrounded by a circle of observers, who set a time and rhythm with chants and percussion, following the lead of the master. This gathering is a friendly competition, where the goal isn't to hurt, but often simply to throw the other off rhythm. Since that's set by the observers, it becomes an action of the whole community, even if two share the spotlight. In some videos that are longer, you can see the mutual respect as one participant backs out when they feel they've been bested for another one to step up. They test their skills, train against each other, and observe others' technique all at once. You can probably see how this became so effective. Now, the eventual destruction of the quilombos and the end of slavery in Brazil, combined with increased urbanization, led to a spread of capoeira well outside of these communities and into the larger world. As all kinds of people intermingled in a closer space than ever, a healthy communal activity like capoeira flourished. Kind of. In 1890, it was outlawed both for its martial elements and also its African origins, with punishments as harsh as torture or even death. For 40 years this remained, until the 1930s saw a lessening of this repression, and in 1932 the first official school for capoeira was opened by Mestre Bimba, who both developed his own style with a martial focus, and went on to be the first to present the form as an official practice of Brazilian culture. Clearly, what we see animated is an aggressively stylized version of this, but you can recognize some of the hallmarks with this still. Her motions have a heavy emphasis on kicks over any other kind of contact, quite true to form, and despite her shorter stature, these land fairly high on her foes, representative of the sweeping upward strikes exchanged. It's an interesting note how Hiroe gave her an advantage in this way, since her hands were naturally free for weapons. However, this does limit her ability to use her hands in contact with the ground, which is something you'll recognize in a lot of those videos, usually facilitating that fantastic upwards motion. But the inversion these moves achieve is still very present, since Fabiola is upside down or sideways fairly often, a take on the leaps and flips you'll witness from practitioners. The fluid spinning motions are expressed very well in the anime, adding its own style for sure, but more or less exaggerating reality rather than making something up and labeling it with a real-world concept. I think this is also where the mook chivalry present in Black Lagoon makes the most sense. Now, mook chivalry is that narrative style of fighting where enemies just so happen to come at the hero one at a time. Now, watching two experienced practitioners handle themselves, it seems almost easy to predict the moves from the other, but imagine what this would look like to someone with no experience. You need a second to adjust to it and thus kind of fight one-on-one. You're waiting for a punch and suddenly your foe hits the ground and kicks upwards at you. While Fabiola may not be the most powerful character in Black Lagoon, she has the most surprising style, which gives her a reasonable edge. It makes sense she would kick some wannabe gangster ass. These aren't trained fighters, these are just power-hungry guys with guns. A dedicated studier of martial arts would easily handle these kinds of foes. While Black Lagoon remains exaggerated in its moments of action, it stays true to form in respecting and implementing the real history and concepts it was inspired by.
Fabiola told me that she's from the barrios of Caracas. And at night, that entire area of the city glitters like the Milky Way.
It's from this line, much like Balalaika's about Panshir, that we can really dig into Fabiola's past. I'll be sticking to her own words here just as a quick note. She describes her home as being full of low lives, just like Roanapur, and when asked to elaborate, she says further that where she grew up was the slums of Caracas, where the homeless sleep and every volt of electricity is stolen. She doesn't sound too fond of her home, the outskirts of Caracas, so let's look into why she may not be. Now, when looking at somewhere in turmoil, the only proper way to begin is by going back and examining the root causes, so let's get into a very brief history of modern Venezuela. Our concerns start where it seems most of the world did just over 100 years ago, when geologists from the Royal Dutch Shell Company struck oil there. And yes, it is that shell you're thinking of. But this led to an absolute oil boom, and under dictator General Juan Vicente Gomez, over 100 foreign companies began producing oil in Venezuela, exporting 127 million barrels of oil, making up 90% of the country's exports by 1929. As the 1930s rolled around though, 3 specific companies controlled 98% of that production. Gomez's successors sought to fix this. The Hydrocarbons Law of 1943 was the first step in that direction, requiring foreign companies to give half of their oil profits to the state. Within 5 years, the government's income had increased 6-fold. Venezuela was starting to capitalize on being the country on the earth with the most oil reserves. And that capitalization turned inwards too. 1958 saw the first democratic elections after successive military dictatorships, where 3 parties were on the ballot in cooperation. However, the entire system of power depended on who controlled the oil, since it was the supermajority of the country's economy. So these 3 sides created the Punto Filo Pact, which split the oil revenue proportional to voting. It was an attempt to curb dictatorship by splitting up that power, but it ended up doing little more than concentrating wealth within the state. The governments which arose in the wake of these reforms were described as enduring but low quality, repressive, unrepresentative, and with a crisis of legitimacy, stability at the expense of representation, as 2 of the 3 parties survived, but had little reason to accurately represent their population. The only mitigation of this was that with enough wealth, even the most selfish of leaders will throw some around to keep people calm. Social programs were implemented throughout the country's history, but only really with the motivation of keeping the populace complacent while the rich got richer. And there was no time when the country was richer than the 1970s. In 73, OPEC, that's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, placed an embargo on other countries who backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. This spiked petroleum prices by 4 times. Now that's quite a leap for any oil-producing country, but imagine if oil was upwards of 90% of your economy. Venezuela didn't have to imagine. In 2 years, 11 billion was added to the state, 55 billion adjusted for today. It became the place to be, with not just Latin Americans, but Americans on the whole flocking to the country to share in these spoils. Well, there's even more to cover in this time. Eventually it would all collapse. The late 70s saw the implementation of the Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., which oversaw all exploring, producing, refining, and exporting of oil, allowing 40% partnerships with foreign investors, and nearly independent action from the government for the oil industry. So when oil prices plummeted in the 1980s, meaning this time 90% of the economy dropped out rather than rising up, President Carlos Andrés Pérez tried to curb this issue by purchasing those foreign refineries, an attempt which miserably failed. Inflation soared, deadly riots ensued, and shortages were commonplace. On February 18, 1983, or Viernes Negro as it is known in Venezuela, the government established currency controls, something Chavez would do 20 years later, to stop this flight and halt inflation. Purchasing power declined by almost 75% overnight. With the economy, the single factor that pulled the government together to begin with, utterly tanked, political instability grew, with the 1990s seeing multiple failed coups and impeachments. And with Black Lagoon's rough date of the 1990s, that brings us to Fabiola. One interesting note there, however, Blood Trail gives us a specific year of 1996 seen on Diego Lovelace's tombstone, but his death includes mention of the Fifth Republic movement, or the MVR, the Venezuelan party which supported Hugo Chavez, which wasn't established as a party until July 1997. This is an interesting flaw I wanted to bring up because one of the things I loved about researching the show was playing detective with only the early to mid 90s to go off of, so this timeline conflict is supremely odd in a series with minimal historical oddities. However, 1996 makes Fabiola's timeline match up quite well with the economic downturn of Venezuela. If we assume her to be somewhere from 14 to 18 since we don't have an exact age, that means she was born between 1978 and 1982, so her formative years she could remember would all be spent in the post-oil boom times. While the glitz and glamour of the 1970s already wasn't spread evenly, the conditions were only worse now that the entire pie had shrunk. There's not much doubt this would have led to an expansion of the barrios where she lived. These are homegrown settlements on the outskirts of the planned urban centers, sprawling out in whichever direction the next inhabitant chooses, as they literally build their home off of others. Many families can spend an entire generation or more completing their house, gathering up their own supplies to put up dwellings consisting of small rooms and narrow corridors connected to those before them. Floating tin roofs and unfinished walls are some of the most common sights, since everyone is a constantly evolving project. These areas became home to large percentages of the population, and Caracas is home to the most expansive continuous section of barrios in the world. Since they're unplanned and unpermitted developments, the infrastructure and community organization relies almost entirely on local efforts and leaders. These citizens will either pay for or implement themselves the needed solutions, or merge together to spur on actions from local governments. From this, a sense of community emerges, and many say spotting an outsider to a specific area is easy, since most residents know almost everyone. Now, it doesn't help that the lack of organization in sprawling area makes travel quite difficult or time-consuming as well. While these areas can be dangerous, often controlled by local gangs, a sense of community still persists. Some YouTube channels which explored the area explained that they were left alone since they showed local relief efforts that were helping to feed children. While these are dangerous areas which can often be gang controlled, you can see that even the criminals here shy away from doing active harm to positive community efforts. And with this focus on local efforts spurred on by a lack of support from higher sources, it's something you'll notice in many travel vlogs. There's plenty of videos with names like Solo in the most dangerous town of X country, which clickbait based off of this danger, but find from talking to local citizens that a sense of community and pride and almost hope always emerges. I can't speak to how true this is for Caracas. I've not been there myself, and the local guides often refuse to leave their motorbikes due to the danger, so I don't mean to minimize a harsh climate. But it's true that even here a sense of responsibility can emerge strong.
Why did you shoot him? The fighting was over! Why did you shoot him?
It's never over until the last shot.
I think this then provides the proper context to finally analyze Fabiola's character. Where else to start but a deep dive into her show-stealing introduction, quite literally as the yellow flag is left speechless before the bar itself is left destroyed. First, let's remember Rock's introduction. The businessman from a quaint, peaceful life in Japan, he questions the gun on every table, uncomfortable with the risks surrounding him and reminiscing about the peaceful hangouts he once knew. We see over his shoulder as that's where he looks, as we're introduced to this new world just as he is. The conflicts and people around him are of note because for him they're new and wild. Then there's Fabiola. She waltzes into the yellow flag and begins to order around the Lagoon crew, saying they must come and see Garcia right away, a stark contrast to Rock's low profile his first time. At least until he was drunk, that is. But surrounded by criminals, grown men staring at her with their hands on their guns, Fabiola doesn't even flinch, let alone pay them attention, focused firmly on her goal instead. Even when things turn sour, much like Roberta, we see very little worry from her. Her response is simply to say,
I have been careless. From the foul stench, I knew this town would be filled with animals.
She has quite the obvious confidence, completely sure that there's no way for this situation to overcome her. Unlike Rock, Fabiola isn't from somewhere that makes the yellow flag new and noteworthy. They even comment on this later, extending it to all of Roanapur.
You don't seem intimidated by this city at all.
The place I'm from was full of lowlifes. It's kind of like coming home.
I don't think we need to belabor how that's explained by her history though, so let's move forward in her introduction. Rock, seeking clarification from her first orders, asks if she's with the Lovelace family, at which point she apologizes and gives a formal introduction, the whole mini-speech about the 13 great families with a bow and all of that. This isn't the only time we see her direct nature overcome pleasantries, as she's moved multiple times to demand direct action from Rock or insult Revy to her face. This is much more than just being an outsider to the city though, and I think we can reason why she isn't so big on formality, despite being in the same role as Roberta, who often showed such things. They each had quite harsh upbringings, but Fabiola's was one more of duty. Over a meal with Rock and Benny, she explains,
Well, I come from a large family of 11, so I'm just glad I could make things a bit easier for my parents.
when you're helping to take care of 10 other people, it's safe to say you'd want to make the most out of every moment. Trying to keep all of that straight, it makes much more sense to be direct, likely shouting over at least a couple other voices most times. To be responsible in that situation sometimes means being loud and commanding because there's no other way. Of course, it's not done with cruelty in mind, simply the physicality of the situation. Formalities are a luxury she can't quite afford. And I think we actually see a lot of those in Roanapur who can. Formalities don't have to be pleasant. Balalaika and Chang and the other heads have moody meetings in bars with dramatic entrances and exits, oftentimes gloating over their foes before they continue to take action. They waste time making a show of their criminal force, often holding their status right in someone's face. It's about power to them and they want you to know. This is what separates Roanapur from other places. People here aren't working towards something tangible or to make the world better, or even sometimes to personal goals. They're just hungering for power, and each action is a step in its cycle as they continue doing what they ever know, never changing. Meanwhile, Fabiola is from somewhere where families had to literally build their own homes and did so with hope for the future. But we'll have more on that later. For now, it introduces us to her focus, responsibility. She wants to get the job done and get back to her usual duties. When they can't move forward is when she grows frustrated. This is so deeply ingrained into her character that she doesn't even like to be seen relaxing. Since she and Garcia are staying at one of Chang's nice houses, there's naturally a pool out back, something of great interest to her, but you almost wouldn't know it. She waits until Garcia is sound asleep, sneaks outside and goes for a swim. Whenever he catches her, she's truly embarrassed and apologetic profusely to Garcia. These are the deeply dug claws of responsibility through and through. Until Roberta is back safe and sound, there's still work to be done. And while there's work to be done, it's not okay to relax. The embarrassment isn't for swimming itself, but rather for taking time off the job. It's like getting caught playing a game on your phone by your boss during a really tight deadline. While she does love the family she works for, this is also a way to support hers back home. While the Lovelaces aren't as rich as any of the other families anymore, they still own a large amount of land in their manor. They know Fabiola is supporting a large family since Garcia doesn't react to her saying it, and so they likely pay her at least a little bit to send back home so she can support her family. And if not, her support might just be taking one more mouth to feed away while living with the Lovelaces. Knowing how easily her performance could mark the difference between her family eating and not, of course she's going to feel pressure to be on at all times. When there's so much on your back, you're forced to do amazing things. Like every parent who works 2 jobs for their kids, essentially then end the cycle of work. They do it because they have to for people they love. She works constantly to the point that relaxing is embarrassing because she works for 11. Not for 1. I guess you could call it 12 though, as she does express a lot of genuine care for Garcia. The moments where she gets flustered are not the ones where she is threatened, but where he is. When she kicks into action in the yellow flag is when they mention paying Garcia's location a visit, and her calm demeanor is entirely broken when she returns to find Chang alone with him, a complete 180 from her introduction. 20 people threatening her, who really cares? But 1 near Garcia, that's a big deal. It ties into her work for sure. Her duty is to protect him, so his safety is also her family's survival. But with their multiple deep talks and praise back and forth, we see it's more than just duty. Garcia actually represents a lot of what Fabiola sees as good in the world. He and Rock are similar characters, and I often refer to him as the ideal Rock. They both enter Roanapur as outsiders and can experience the city's harsh truths, but take different paths in response to this. Rock is clearly changed by what he goes through, succumbing to a path somewhat similar to many of its citizens. He's been screwed over, and so he's going to screw right back. He maintains his desire to help, but also seeks revenge on the city overall, hoping to destroy it through outside intervention and reasoning this as almost a helpful revenge, since then Roanapur can take no more victims. Garcia is similarly wronged by the city, however he solidifies his own ideals and sense of self, rather than morphing due to these pressures. He's accepting of the absolutely brutal tactics of the mercenaries, hardly reacting to Revy's merciless killing while Fabiola reacts strongly, but despite all of this, he'll still cry for the people he loves being hurt. He sees that there's no need to give up his purity to survive. He's a little bit of hope that good people can experience a harsh world and still seek a greater future. A mentality that seems to be common in the informal interviews I've seen from places like where Fabiola grew up. Things aren't ideal, but there's no option but to try and make them better. It would be simpler to give up, but it isn't the only option. And this directly begins to show why she hates Roanapur as well. Everyone here took the simpler path. The easiest response to violence is more violence. Someone wrongs you and you wrong them, and the cycle continues until fighting is the immediate first response. They're justified in this reasoning to some degree, but it's also the very mentality that keeps it as the ruling principle. Fabiola speaks as if she's better than these people because in some ways, she's at least trying harder than them. Her hometown was just as rough, and she compares the two quite casually. Yet even as a child, her way to deal with this was never through the perpetuation of violence. Her most telling statement is when she says,
I didn't live in a nice place, so I had to find a way to stay safe. You can accidentally kill people with a gun, but this way I could hold back.
I think hold back is very key there, as it makes reference to how easy it is to slip into violence. She's not saying that everyone here is missing something easy and obvious. Survival is first and foremost, and she grew up watching that play out. But she also saw individuals who took the harder path and made a difference, showing it was possible. One of the biggest distinctions between Roanapur and the outskirts of Caracas are how they came to be. Let's pick that thread back up to exemplify this difference in mentality. Both are neglect in some way, the former a leftover town from past wars, and the later a place where neglected people had to go. But one was moved into, and the other was created by hand. Roanapur is a city of the dead. People go here to live out their days, static and unchanging. Simply moving into a dead city mirrors this quite exactly. They're here for metaphorical death, the lack of change for the rest of time. They didn't create this, they just stumbled onto somewhere that was good enough and stopped. The barrios, however, were made by their inhabitants. Each family creates their own little slice of necessity, giving a greater drive for community. Even if violence plagues both, one lives and breathes it, one lives and breathes in spite of it, always creating and growing and hoping and pushing for a better future. They may be dangerous, but they also have locals who want something more, who stand out. Not like the essential companies that employ men and women like Chang and Balalaika. Everyone in Roanapur could simply protect themselves rather than actively harming others. But they don't. They choose to hurt.
Listen to me, you cowards! Your friends out there really don't care about you. You are nothing to them.
To me, that mini-speech sums it up the best. No community, no loyalty, no building a future, just backstabbing and fighting. It's a world without hope. But it's far from just some nameless scrubs who she conflicts with to showcase this principle. Most notably is one of the most feared of Roanapur herself, Revy.
How are we different?
What?
A minute ago, you said that we're different. So tell me how we're different exactly.
Something present in Black Lagoon is the idea of seeing the world for what it is. A series which wades in the depths of the human mind and the worst of what we can do, it spares no detail of how awful life can be. This is a constant, and every character faces the realization, or has already faced the realization, that life sucks. But what they do with it is where the magic arises, because it creates conflicts and interactions around this core concept. Revy, as we've spoken to before, takes a path of avoidance. It's the most simplified mindset. Money and guns rule the world. You have them so you can keep having them, and that's all they are. A medal is a medal, a gun is a gun. By following this view that nothing is meaningful, Revy justifies her own behavior. If she didn't kill that guy, someone else would have anyway. These assumptions and non-considerations keep the world easy to understand and make avoiding the pain she felt before the most viable option. To her, really the only option that makes sense. Internally, she's justifying herself and this as logical. Anyone who does otherwise from her is stupid, unaware, or both. This simplicity comes out most when she speaks with Fabiola, who directly calls her out on avoidance. Rock was always a glimmer of hope for Revy, a man in the twilight who could shift between worlds. A possible way out. So she's the last to see him dipping into that darkness, long after Dutch and Benny knew, because she doesn't want to believe that he can. While she'd never express it, deep down, somewhere under the layers of oppression, she knows there's more to the world she would love, but finding it would be mentally harder than simply killing her way through Roanapur. Fabiola is to Revy as Garcia is to Rock. They're similar enough to compare, but not the same. They react differently to the same world. Both are beaten as kids, Revy by her father told in flashbacks, and Fabiola by her mother for stealing a CD player even though it was a gift for her brother. This exchange follows.
That sounds like abuse to me.
Whatever they did out of love.
Well, I'm not the right person to get into the topic of abuse. What we can see from this exchange is how they view these actions. Revy sees her beatings as meaningless. She was there, so she was beat, and now she beats others to avoid it. The lesson was the physicality of it, the surface. Fabiola ascribes meaning to the negative actions of her parents. She was beaten because she did something she shouldn't have. She stole as a gift for her brother, and her mother hit her for theft. The interaction didn't occur in a vacuum, and because of this, she can control the situation. She didn't have to start hurting others before they could hurt her. She instead could avoid the factors which led to hurt in the first place. Don't steal again. Now, there's a lot more nuance to abuse than that, but again, I'm not the right person to speak on it, so I'd rather continue on Fabiola's mindset. What she thinks is a lot more complex and requires making considerations others aren't, putting her at a disadvantage. It would be easy to simply hit others first, but she doesn't. And the frustration of this shows in her direct nature, where she calls Revy an idiot without hesitation. She feels a reason to act superior to the citizens of Roanapur because she has to work around their terrible behavior. It's possible to be kind despite it all. We know that because of her and Garcia. These people are just in some way refusing to do so, making her life harder and continuing the cycle of why bother. All these people without responsibility look at her as if she's a mirror.
We're different, but you think we come from the exact same place. That's because you want to be saved by some hero.
And that's the game. One of these two is taking actions for what she wants. The other is wishing that it'll come to her. One is mature, trying to understand and help the world. The other is throwing tantrums like a child. What's great about the series is I understand and love both of them and their reasonings. Revy feels relatable in not wanting to fix the world because it's a responsibility no one should have to bear. She mopes around, she takes the easiest path, she doesn't want to uncover that her desires are at odds with the world. All of that stuff is a lot of work. But Fabiola also presents the case that nevertheless it is possible, and her success compared to Revy's constant stasis makes it clear which route is better. Neither of these two existing invalidates the experiences or choices of the other, something Fabiola even stresses by saying the difference between her and Revy is who they met in life, and that there's even still hope for her. Life is complex, and we can't help a lot of things. It serves as a reminder that not everything is as simple as it seems. If we look at everyone as living the same life as us, we'll only keep making mistakes and justifying our bad behavior. Fabiola accepts the reaction to life as more important, judging based not on situation, but on action. She can love Garcia even though he's privileged because he responds to hardship the way she finds ideal. His reactions speak to his true character. And Revy's do too. And it shows us something awful. And when someone shows you who they are, believe them. Yes, these two women came from comparable situations, but not everyone is making a choice to live the way you are. Revy decided on Roanapur. Fabiola didn't. Whether better or worse, responsibility is a harsh task that dictates the direction for many. Revy giving up only hurts herself, while Fabiola giving up hurts a whole family of 10 others. Well, she could, it's still her life and her choice. I think any of us would be hard-pressed to live with our choice after that. And so we find the core of Fabiola, responsibility. A woman from the barrios of Caracas who embodies the hope of their citizens, the drive and determination to build their own lives for the better, who modifies a deep cultural tradition with roots in fighting oppression to fend off the evil of a damned city. While her story is more loosely around history than some of the others, I think she's still a great lesson that shows the deep dedication and care of Hiroe's work and how much we can learn from it. Now, I want to get back to addressing the ads on this video real briefly. The decline of Venezuela's economy was a brief note for us here today, but it serves as the basis for real-world crisis. A combination of mismanagement, blatant corruption, and global economic factors led to the shocking estimation by the UN in 2019 that 94% of Venezuelans lived in poverty. In 2018, the murder rate was 81.4 per 100,000, not helped by the reported 5,000 plus extrajudicial killings in 2017 from a government known to kill in retaliation for resistance. In 2014, the inflation rate hit 800%. Imagine your purchasing power changing by 800%. The Chavez government, which led to the current rule by Maduro today, is an ongoing absolute disaster that regular people pay for every day, to the point that some 20% of the country's population has sought refuge elsewhere. And side note, if they come here, let them the hell in. A situation as serious as that is something I believe would be excessively inappropriate for me to make money off of by talking about in regards to an anime, no matter how well it can represent history. But if a video on YouTube doesn't have ads enabled, it will never do well, and these are topics I want to reach a wider audience. So I made the decision to donate 1/4 of my last month's ad revenue and 1/4 of my last month's Patreon income, since I post 4 videos a month, to the charity Alimenta la Solidaridad, which provides food security, health, and nutrition services, education, and training for community members to then educate others themselves or make income from the training they received, and even more than that. From everything I found, it seemed like a reputable organization, which is involved directly with those communities in need and their local leaders. The programs seem designed not just to put a band-aid over the wound, but to try and provide the means for further growth and advancement while still helping right now. I'll leave a link in the pinned comment in place of my usual links if you want to donate as well. But I hate to spoil the ending of the video with rambling, so a thank you to those doing this amazing work in person, to Hiroe for including such a wide range of topics I'd never know about without his work, and to all of you for spending a bit of time with me today for something so important. I hope you'll do so again sometime soon.